think will be the next big design breakthrough in high-rise super tall?
Yeah. Design breakthrough is often associated with a brief breakthrough, and it's my strong belief, having worked here for 30 years in Asia, that the building type, the high-rise tower as a building type, is not necessarily correct for the emerging economies of Asia. What we're looking at the moment is single-core towers, which have a maximum depth of outside wall to core of anything between 10 meters for residential to 15 to 20 meters for office towers. Well, where did that come from? And that came from the 19th century regulations about light planning and air sanitation regulations after the typhoid outbreaks of the 19th century. So that's moved across then into New York, Manhattan planning of the 19th century, the mid-20th century planning of New York. It's a westernized concept. Why should a high-rise building be a high-rise tower as opposed to a high-rise slab or a high-rise block? Why should we be limited to a 2,000 square meter floor plate? What about a 10 or 20,000 square meter floor plate? Why should we be limited to horizontal movement in a basement or a podium when it can just as easily be affected at any level? And these building types were tried in the 1960s in both Europe and America. Streets in the air for residential, very large floor plates going up from ground, not as a series of towers, but as connected towers or as connected cores. So what I think we're going to see in China is there's a huge demand to build high-rise, but high-rise buildings. And we're going to find the buildings becoming much bigger, floor plates becoming bigger. I'm not talking about high-rise towers anymore, but high-rise buildings. So it's a little bit like the old analogy of why build a tower in the middle of a park when you can put the same area into 4-story buildings around the outside edge of a park. But now what we're saying is, why build many towers in a park when you could build one 20 or 30 or 40-story building around the perimeter of the park?
As this building type develops, one issue is the connectivity between buildings. And there's been various answers to that in certain parts of the world with walkways and various forms of interconnectedness. How do we accomplish that? Is there going to be some kind of breakthrough moving between buildings as opposed, or in addition to moving within them?
Well, I think the breakthrough is a mental breakthrough. It's a breakthrough of a Western designer understanding that it's not just about vertical movement. It's about connectivity between vertical movement. So once you get people up to zones, you can then connect them. You connect them to the 20th floor, the 50th floor, whichever floor you wish. You don't. Obviously, we don't want to have connectivity at every floor. That would be extremely inefficient. But having established villages in the air, we can connect between those villages and then create an entire habitat in the air, as opposed to separating our people via vertical cores.
How will tall buildings be different 20 years from now?
As opposed to tall buildings relying upon the structural dynamics of cores and outriggers, they will start to rely upon the structural dynamics of frame buildings. So we revert to frame as being the, and as a reversion definitely, frame being the core structural principle of high-rise buildings. Cores may become stiffeners within those frames, but I think it'll be cross-brace frames or stiff frames.
I'm just kind of running down the list here, but just in the form of tall buildings, the morphology, as opposed to one big structure, sketch for us the kind of design you're talking about, what that might look like.
Okay, well, it's going to be different for different building types. But let's take residential as an example. And a lot of the requirements of residential at the moment throughout the world, and especially in China, are about light and air. So if we're going to carry out full residential tower design in China, we need 1 or 2 hours of sunlight penetrating into every apartment, therefore the apartments face south, and so on and so forth. If those regulations get relaxed, and there's every reason they should, because we don't need to have 2 hours of sunlight every day. There's other more important things like clean air. Then we can generate courtyard housing in the sky. We accept courtyard housing at ground level, which doesn't have a view out. but it has a view of your own courtyard in a Japanese house. Why can't we develop that in the sky? If that's acceptable to the market, then you can envisage a whole cluster of courtyard housing in the sky, connected by streets and alleyways and courts, and there you have a whole new building morphology.
Which is the single best tall building in the world and why? And maybe the way I would angle that question for you is there a building or are there buildings in the world today that are starting to employ what you've talked about? What are you watching?
Okay, so the most innovative building which is going in the right direction, in the direction I believe high buildings will go as opposed to high towers will go, we're starting to see them in China now. We're starting to see residential buildings that connect, mixed-use buildings that connect, not just with sky bridges, but have fundamental connections at many levels, which break them down from being one tower or a series of towers into one multiply connected building. We're starting to see buildings that are connected at sky lobbies at multiple levels. And I'd say those are the best buildings in the world right now because they're envisaging a new future. They're seeing the way ahead